thanks everyone for inviting me to speak here. My name is Laurence Ferry and I'm a professor at Durham University. This talk might be slightly different to the others in that it's looking at the regulatory space in audit in the public services. In particular in the UK local government, which you'll see later is a big area of expenditure and will be incredibly important coming out of COVID-19. Just in case you're wondering, that's a drawing of me outside the UK Parliament, where I'm currently an advisor. This project's based on part of the work that I've done there that's currently changing the regulations in the UK. So just in terms of areas to be covered, the first thing that I want to do is set out some literature around regulatory space, and more specifically how that ties into public audit. Then I'll go through the methodology that was adopted here in terms of the research case and methods. And finally, I'll look through the findings. There's primarily 4 key findings. These are part of policy development in the UK at the moment. And as you will see later, will have a big policy impact. And at the end, I'll look at some theoretical discussion around how we extend the regulatory space. Okay, what is regulatory space? Because maybe not everybody's familiar with this concept, but basically it's an abstract space and it's the set of regulatory issues that are subject to decisions made by state agencies. So the different institutions that would set up the regulations within a geographical domain, if you like. And it's that abstract space, that regulatory space, that allows discussions, negotiations, and things to take place around what activities are deemed appropriate for the various regulators and regulatees in that marketplace. Now, the big problem is, in recent years, that regulatory spaces have just been completely unfit for their purpose. This has been going on probably ever since I was a student, certainly since the 1980s, but however, since the financial crisis 2008, there's been various crises where countries have actually felt the bits, for want of a better word, and private sector problems. Part of the private sector problems in particular for the big 4 auditing firms, not being able to carry out their audits properly, and whether that regulatory space is actually fit for purpose moving forward. What we actually see is that's having impacts on the public sector also. So, like I say, in recent decades, there's been a problem for the audit regulatory space, but that's fell over into things like the profession and practice. And there's been various studies on this in terms of professionalisation, what constitutes a professional person, and the regulatory relationships that underpin that. So there's been lots of publications in this area at respected international journals. However, what I'm interested in is this idea of public audit. And more importantly, public audit because it underpins public accountability. And as you'll know, public accountability because that underpins the society and democracies or governments that we live in. So if you have an audit that underpins accountability in the US, that might underpin a different type of democracy, say it compared to the UK, or the audit system that underpins accountability in China underpins a very different type of state apparatus. So that's why I'm interested in audit, because it underpins what happens at the state level. And there's 2 specific things that happen in audit that are important. The first one's the financial audit that we're all familiar with, where we're checking to make sure the accounts give a true and fair view. But in the public services, there's also something called value for money, and that's to ensure the accounts look at economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in terms of that the inputs create the necessary outputs, create the necessary outcomes for citizens and society. And just to give you an example of this, if you look at somewhere like San Antonio in Texas and their local authority, they've just brought in something called equity-based budgeting that looks at what I would call a philosophy of audit, which is equity, to make sure fairness is being carried out for citizens. And I see that access or that aspect of audit becoming even bigger with things like Black Lives Matter. So just to be clear here, when we're on about audit, we're not just on about the financial audit, but the value for money, economy, efficiency and effectiveness, and also a fourth E, equity, that looks at fairness for citizens. In terms of studies, I'll not go through them all, but studies have covered all of these aspects before, and there's a lot of work currently looking at a critical appraisal of audit for its role and how it shapes public interest in society. Now, what is the gap that I want to look at? Well, it's our knowledge around how contemporary public sector audit practices actually work in the regulatory spaces that they inhabit. Now, in the UK, this has become a big thing because the private sector audit market is failing. The big four audit firms have been in for a lot of criticism after major frauds and company collapses recently, such as Carillion. And some of those concerns have fell over into the public audit market. So we've had reviews by the great and good, high-level business figures, such as the Bryden report, the Competition Markets Authority report, and the Kingram review. However, I actually carried out a review for the Parliamentary Select Committee that was sent by the Secretary of State to Sir Tony Redmond, who's now looking at a review for local government, of which I sit on the steering panel. That will come out in September. So that'll be a fundamental change to how audit's actually done. Where did this come from? Well, the Kingman review looked at the private sector, but had to look at the public sector for when it looked at the Financial Reporting Council. In particular, it looked at local government. Now, in England, local government accounts for £96 billion per year. So it's a large part of the economy because it accounts for 30% of all UK public expenditure. So it's a significant amount of expenditure. And my review was done for Parliamentary Select Committee, and as I said, that'll inform the review to be done by Sir Tony Redmond. So it's in this context that my paper here, that I'll now go on to, should be seen, because it's a comparative study of not just what happens in England, but a comparative study of what happens in the rest of the UK. Now, as some of you will know, the UK is made up of 4 countries, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And whilst the Parliament in Westminster sets strategic direction for many things such as defence, each of these individual countries can determine a lot of what they want to do in the public services themselves. Okay, now why is this important as a research space? Because it has important lessons not just for the UK regulatory space in terms of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also how these factors can work for other countries around the world in terms of translating global regulatory trends. So what happens in the national context in the UK, for instance, could inform the rest of the Commonwealth, a lot of what use the Westminster model of accountability. That would include countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also for comparative studies which would be contrasting to this in different ways, such as France, which uses a Napoleonic code, or the US, which uses a very different type of model, used more on rules rather than principles. So there's good reasons for doing these comparative studies. Also, the UK actually over the last decade has looked at austerity in a big way, but also localism. A lot more power was passed to the local levels, a bit like passing power to state levels in the US. So it's important to look at how that worked in the UK context. Okay, in terms of research methods, what was done here? Well, in 2018 and 2019, I was actually an academic fellow at Parliament, and in 2020, I'm actually an advisor. And there's me on the left of my screen, the guy in glasses with the red tie, giving evidence on Brexit. There might be some other people that some of you might recognise. One of the other guys is Tony Travers, and another one is Rob Whiteman, the chief executive of SIPFA, which Rutgers, for instance, has a strategic relationship with. So that was actually at Parliament. What I specifically looked at was audit and inspection in English local government, and that, like I say, has become a comparative study. I should point out this is the roots of this goes back further, at least 5 or 6 years, where I worked with the National Audit Office in the UK on some of this study. That's our supreme audit institution. It would be a bit like the Government Accountability Office in the US. Okay, how was this study done? It involved interviews. There was 50 or 60 interviews done with the directors and senior managers of the key institutions. So there was the Parliamentary Select Committee. There was the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, which is our civil service department looking after local government. There was the National Audit Office, that's our supreme audit institution. There's SIPFA, which is the leading body in the world for public services accounting. There was the procurement organisation, PSAA, who appoints the auditors. There's the Financial Reporting Council. There was the audit firms, the Big Four, but also other firms involved in this market, and the local authorities themselves. That's Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I interviewed the lead auditor and the deputy there who had local government responsibility. As you can see, there was also a lot of document review, the history of these bodies going back in some ways to bodies prior to these institutions, even going back at least 100 years, legislation, audit codes, assurance reports, news articles, etc. So it was incredibly comprehensive. On top of that, I was lucky, I had full observation. I was able to visit the different parliaments, the ministries, the regulatory bodies, various audit firms to see how they operated, etc. What came out of this analysis was various main themes, as you can see below, which I'll pick up again later. What were the key findings though? The key findings are really across 4 areas. They relate around organisation and fragmentation. So was the audit regulatory space a single space where everybody knew each other, talked to each other regularly, or was this fragmented? It wasn't coordinated. There was a problem where they didn't speak to one another. Did auditors have proper independence from the organisation appointing them, and could they report independently? Did the market have proper competition and was sustainable? And then what was the audit scope? Was it just a financial audit? Was there proper value for money? Did it look at issues like fairness? And last but not least, did it go beyond inspection of audit? And did it go further to look at things like performance management, performance improvement, rankings, league tables, that kind of thing? So they were the 4 key areas that I'll focus in on. So first of all, in England, if we go back, there was previously an institution called the Audit Commission. This was the regulator, if you like. And before 2014, this organisation oversaw all local government audit and most local public service audit, such as the National Health Service, police, fire, etc. However, it was abolished. And when that was abolished, various other bodies picked up the arrangements. And these arrangements were somewhat fragmented. It meant there was no single agency looking after local public audit in England. Instead, there was various bodies. These bodies included the National Audit Office, who became responsible for the audit code, the PSAA, who became responsible for procurement auditors, the Financial Reporting Council, who looked after whether auditors were doing the audit to recognise quality, and various supervisory bodies, such as parts of the profession. However, whilst in England it wasn't coordinated anymore, what we can see in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, there was still one supreme audit institution looking after all of these areas of local public audit. So you can see there was a different fragmentation. Now, the second thing that I should point out, there was auditor independence and competition. In England, the Audit Commission was abolished, so there was no local public audit service and no independence. In other words, individual local authorities could appoint their own auditors, although in reality they use something called public sector audit appointments. Therefore, now all auditors are from private sector firms. So let me repeat that so people understand this. There was no longer a central regulatory body. There's no public audit service. all audits are carried out by the private sector. That is completely different to the rest of the UK. Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales still have a local public audit service, although they will use some private firms, much like what England was like before 2014. So that's a big change. The regulatory space has become much more private in England. The rest of the UK is much more public orientated. The third point is the audit scope. All of these countries give an opinion on the financial statements, and the auditors have similar statutory powers. However, value for money is very different. In England, all they look at is whether value for money is in place. In other words, a local authority has proper arrangements in place to say that value for money is being looked at, not whether value for money is delivered. However, in the rest of the UK, they don't just look at the financial audit, they also look at whether parts of value for money are delivered. In fact, in Wales, they look at performance improvement and they look at future generations, whether there will be equity to generations in the future and generations now. In other words, there's fair tax distribution. In Scotland, they still have a lot of performance improvement and best value arrangements. These are looked at on a 5-year cycle. In terms of inspection, England used to probably have one of the biggest inspection regimes in the whole world. Prior to 2010, they used to have something called comprehensive performance assessment. Local authorities were actually ranked and placed in league tables, but now there's none of that anymore in England. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, they still have inspection, but to different levels. In other words, what has happened here? Well, from a theoretical contribution, we can see that regulatory spaces are combined in terms of having public, private and mixed markets. In England, it's become much more private. In the other countries of the UK, it has become more public. So there has been a divergence, even within the UK, how local audit practices take place. In terms of something like financial stewardship, that remains in place in all of these countries. But however, value for money and fairness are looked at very differently. In England, it's just all regulatory arrangements in place to say value for money has been reported on, not that it's delivered. That's very different to the other countries that look at value for money and fairness in much more detail, and are they being delivered? So, policymakers have to take account of these different regulatory spaces in terms of what that means for policy. So in England at the moment, we are looking, has the privatisation of so much of the public audit market worked? Or have the parts that remain in the public sector sphere benefited from the privatisation, or should this regulatory space be changed? And we've compared that to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in this model as comparators. In terms of taking this forward in the future, we can look in more details of whether there's sustainability of the audit market between these different countries, whether value for money and fairness can be learned lessons in terms of what's done in these different countries, and whether there is proper democratic accountability, and whether it should be the same. Some countries will take very different views of what that regulatory space should look like, as they do in the UK. In terms of future research, what academics might want to look at, they could look at public services outside local government, such as health services, police, fire, armed forces, education. They could do comparative projects with countries that follow the Westminster model. So for instance, you could compare the UK to Australia, Canada, for instance. There could be comparative projects with countries that follow alternative models, such as the US, France, or other countries. And there could be a project that looks at how similar arrangements look in the private sector, which is work that's being carried out at the moment. So what are the key lessons that I wanted to highlight? One, The regulatory space could be private sector, public sector, or mixed. There's no right or wrong answer to that, but this is important because audit underpins accountability, that underpins big issues such as democracy in the state if we're looking at the public sector, or underpins capitalism if we're looking at the private sector. So that's why this is important to look at. That was the point that I wanted to make. Thank you.